Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, a man who will put new life into the blah nightlife of the city of Dullsville.
Tim Longo. No.
Yep. No, you probably won't. You're
Not
probably
me.
like, you know what, folks, take up backpacking. Get out, enjoy some of our natural resources around Dullsville.
Get out of town. Yeah. Forget the city stuff. Where's the wilderness simulator?
Why are you spending time around here? That's Sim Earth, and we already talked about how that was a little too much.
Yeah.
We, of course, are finishing up our series tonight on SimCity, mostly SimCity 2000, because it's what's available to us. And yeah, we have a few things left to talk about. I mentioned there in my intro one of the scenarios that I found when I went looking. I had forgotten that was a thing, and thanks to listener Mystery Dip for writing in. I did not think or have the time to warn Tim that I was going to look at the scenarios, and should have said, "Hey, let's pick a couple and just do them."
Yeah.
Both.
I didn't even think of it.
Yeah, which would have been a good comparison. But we'll have plenty of interesting things, I think, to talk about that. And then, of course, we'll also turn to our takeaways since it's the end of the series for us. Oh, and I need to find that book, and I had one, and dang it. Okay. Anyway, hello. I sort of feel like we should sort of turn to the cartoonishness a little bit first. You had mentioned the disasters as a topic because there's a spectrum from the realistic to the ridiculous there that I think is interesting, and it also might lead into the sort of scenarios that, one of which I explored, which is not ridiculous but is surrounded by several dozen ridiculous scenarios. So I'm curious, Did you engage directly in any of these, or did you just kind of look into them a bit?
Oh, you mean the disasters?
The disasters.
Yeah, no, I actually did all of. Well, I triggered all of them and then but I actually did this last session, I think.
Oh, okay.
And tried to sort of recover, minimally, because I didn't have time to like fully rebuild or anything, but I wanted to see like what impact each of them actually had. And generally they sort of boiled down to sort of the same thing with a few exceptions. Because, you have, actually the flood one was interesting because that was they basically fill in tiles with water throughout your whole city. And then it sort of, the result of all of them was basically destroyed land. Yeah,
property damage. Yeah.
And so the recovery was generally the same with a couple exceptions. And to your point on cartoonishness, like, we still, throughout every episode probably talked a little bit about the sort of sim versus the toy or game versus the toy or what have you. And so, I don't know, it reminds me of one of the emails we got, which was from Mystery, or I forget who was asking us about. Maybe it's Artemis. I was asking.
It was Artemis about what we would do. Yeah.
Yeah, what we would do and how you would, we talked about churches, right, and religion and things like that. But I think the same thing goes for disasters because, it's a isometric, cartoonish look. It's abstracted, right? And you're very removed from what's happening, as we talked about, right? You can't control or even understand individual people, and you're very much like there's this distanced effect, right? And so that gives them a certain amount of permission to, I guess, go into the satirical direction, if you will. And so when they get to the point of disasters, which is like, I guess when you have a successful city, where do you go? To make it interesting for the player, you add disasters, which is like the Deus Ex Machina of like, you can't control the weather, or whatever it is. And that leads to Godzillas and the Mario boss that I'm blanking on.
Oh, Bowser.
Bowser. Like, I don't know why I couldn't think of Bowser right then. Bowser's or whatever, and in my case, it's a robot.
Well, I mean, you think of him as the president of Nintendo.
Yeah, exactly. Now, that's why I'm confused. I was like, wait, Bowser, that doesn't sound right. That's the dude. Anyway, In my case, it's a robot. um, so it's like what compels them to think that is the end, that is important to the end game. And so it's fun, I guess, and you can see sort of the wackiness of it. But as we've been talking about throughout the series, it's like, if you think too hard about it, you're a little bit like, wait a second, because in my case, I'm triggering these, right? They can't, actually, no, I take that back. 2 of them happened in my speed run naturally.
Right. Some things will happen naturally.
Yeah, yes. They happen naturally, and then the rest of them I trigger just to see what would happen. But, in some cases, there's like, oh, there's a plane crash, like a passenger plane crash, and you're like, I don't know about, and
right.
And you think, okay, today, and this is why I maybe think of Artemich's mail is like, what decisions would you make today? Is like, I guarantee you, City Skylines does not have a plane crash, as a natural disaster. So I'm not trying to call anyone out from the past, but because of that distancing and that cartoonishness or that obfuscation of like reality, they had a brainstorm list of disasters, and this is, that's where they end up. And it just kind of goes back to, I guess, that sort of like, I don't know, repercussions sounds too heavy, but there's sort of repercussions to those decisions when you're playing to sort of diminish. Because I mean, those things were happening then. It's not like this was that long ago. There were terrible disasters happening in every category except for the robot. So
sure.
So it's like, I don't know. I guess we've just like, I think
also
we've
strange,
fully overthought this game. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's. I mean, I think it's a lot harder not to now when some of the. I mean, you talk about flooding. It's like Mississippi is flooding or about to flood right now. Kentucky flooded last week.
Pakistan right now too. Yeah.
Katrina and Pakistan right now as well. Yeah, I saw that as well, and that's just horrendous. Katrina, of course, a decade and a half ago or so, and then of course, and those are just going to get worse. So it's hard not to look at that. I was reading something last week where it's like California may basically become an inland sea, if, this once in a, whatever number of years thing occurs. And I was like, oh man, and of course stuff about what about the Greenland ice shelf? And I mean, it's part of our lives now as a fact of global warming and of more energy and weather systems. Speaking as a person who literally had a storm drop a tree on his house, like I get it, I felt it, and it's scary. And it's hard not to take that as scary. And a plane crash also tough. It's another thing where I actually recently was reading The Boys and watching the show.
Oh,
and they lean into that. I
didn't see that coming.
Well, they lean into specifically the 9/11, tragedy, disaster / event. Different ways in the comic and in the show. The show, they actually take it away from 9/11, but it's specifically part of the comic. I think that's partly timing and when they're supposed to be set. But I mean, it's hard to think of treating that in this sort of cheeky way, like, oh yeah, just trigger this thing to happen to your city. Mm-hmm. I remember back in 1989, playing in my dorm room and just like, oh yeah, let me trigger one after the other, one by one, and just see the absolute terror that is wrought upon my city. Not even to recover, just to be the kid, kicking over the sandcastle, more than anything else. It's just, okay, well, what horrible things are now going to happen? Can I trigger them on top of one another? Oh, look, Godzilla and a hurricane both coming at the same time. And just, having that sort of playful destruction that I don't think I could have fun with today. I specifically looked at the scenarios and steered away from all the disaster ones because, I mean, I think it's interesting to know how things recover, but I also don't think we're going to recover in the same ways. For example, I don't think it models like, well, you can tell me if I'm wrong. Did you get a sudden influx of cash from the federal government?
No. Yeah. No.
Right?
There's
there's
no system for that, right? In the game.
Yeah. And also and again, that touches on my lack of human scale. You were describing it you lose a lot of land and stuff. And it's those people lost everything is what I go to, those people who live by the river who maybe couldn't afford flood insurance, et cetera, et cetera. I'm too wrapped up in the reality of human lived experience now, to find that playful, which, I don't think it's a wrong thing to play with. This is not moral censure on my part. I just personally have a difficult time letting go of our current reality, to enjoy that sort of thing in a simulation myself.
Yeah. Well, and I think I'm trying to place myself in a different place, obviously, than when I played it before, when I wasn't thinking about these things. And of course there's age, but then I'm also thinking, would I want, how would I talk to my child about playing this game when they were younger? Or what kind of conversations would we have? Because I also wouldn't want to censor it, but I would want to have a conversation about it, hey, there are repercussions to what we're doing here. Did you think, what I mean? So I think it's it's great in that regard of it's going to trigger conversation that could result in, good, not education, but sort of education, but good.
Yeah. I mean, it's reflection, let's say.
Reflection's good.
Even thinking about it, I think is interesting. I think there's value in that, even just having a reaction of oh, I can't do that. I can't do that because that's I don't know. I don't want to go there. Is it okay, why does that bother you, personally? Well, because, some of the reasons I talk about, or maybe how, somebody else might react to that stuff or whatever, could be at different levels depending on, for example, a child's moral development. Where are they currently?
Yeah, right.
It might be, well, it's my town. Why would I destroy it? Right. Which is a sort of I don't know I guess you'd call a moral level 1 or 2. There's 7 levels of morality as posited by somebody, so it's I don't know, it's probably a little higher than that. But it becomes, the higher up that scale you get, the more, you kind of are looking at the suffering, of different kinds, and are empathizing more the further you get to the top of that scale. And now I can't remember the name of that scale. It's going to bother me. So, yay me.
Well, I mean,
anyway.
to that point, I'm thinking about this as you're talking, and this is probably being a little over dramatic about it, but when it comes to the moral responsibility within the video game space, and obviously the poster child for that is usually shooters, first-person shooters especially. Sim games never come up, simulation games where you are the master of many more lives in a way, and and if you do, say you do go into politics or social or city planning or or anything like that as a career, as a yeah, I don't know. Or
even just being a social worker, where you're kind of held up in those systems, right? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to interact
or
with
firefighter.
Paramedic, sure, firefighter, policeman, or even any other kind of social leader, and those can be from a number of different sort of community walks of life. There's politics, of course, but then there's also, religious leaders, for example, or even, big business leaders in an area and what their responsibility is, to the area that has sort of allowed them to succeed, presumably, because otherwise they're probably not big civic leaders in that respect. So, I mean, there's just a lot of different factors and how you think about that. And, I still will say, like, applaud this game for however many years later now, almost 30 years later, us like talking about all these very heady topics that we don't tend to talk about.
Totally.
Even when we talk about some of our favorite and most ethically probing games like Shadow of the Colossus, for example, games that really make us question our motivations as players or what have you. And here, because it's meant to in some way in a, I don't know, almost a circus tent mirror way, funhouse mirror way is what I was looking for, reflect reality. The manual is very cheeky, for example. I mean, there's one point where I can't even remember what the bar is, but it's like the phrase in the manual is like belly up to the such and such bar. It's like, okay. It's like, and it's just, it's the whole manual. It's everywhere in the writing. It's very, comedic and from a very specific point of view, like we've talked about before. But it still manages to provoke in us, at least, these sort of levels of discussions, which I still think is an amazing achievement. That it's deep enough and enough is going on in it, and I guess it invites us to project onto it. I mean, again, I think that's that same level of like, how we are further developed now than we were then, when it came out, and of course we bring more to the game, so that's true of a lot of games, but as I think, I don't even remember who the critic actually is who said it, but a man walked into the movie theater and the critic was that man. I know Roger Ebert quoted that, but I don't remember who the original source is. So you're reflecting on your own specific response to a game when we talk about these things. So it's not meant to be objective. There's no objective. So
I'd be interested. Yeah, I mean, maybe we have listeners who would be able to answer this, but I'd be interested to. I'm sure with a little bit of internet research, we could probably find some answers to this. But I'd be interested to know if there's anybody, because to your point on social leaders or leaders in general, like even the advisors in the budget panel. They have faces, they have comments they make. You can, each of them have an identity. Those are all important jobs in the world. And it'd be interesting to know if anybody who played this game as a younger person did glean or be inspired or understand anything, even if it's just a 1% more than they did before they played it, and had an influence on where they ended up for a career, or I don't know, there's, because there's so many aspects to this game, and because it's a simulation, there are elements that are, so many different elements and jobs and careers are represented here, at least in a abstract way.
Sure.
So,
there's urban planning, obviously, but also like regional sciences. That was a major at Penn, where I went to undergrad. There's, I only know that because I had a friend who was in it. But yeah, I think social work and like a lot of the programs that are there. There's even like public health, right, is a thing that, in kind of a very surface level way, but it's still represented there as something you have to think about. Of course, it's all, it's on our minds based on the past couple of years, but it's still something that's there. And then, everything down to the transportation, which actually itself has a lot more complex stuff that you can do in terms of what you're going to spend more time on or less time on. It's just, there's so many like individual, like, okay, yeah, you can do this kind of gross level, but then if you really want to get into it, you gotta dig in and do the nitty gritty of individual systems. There's a lot here, which I think that the choices that are made I was looking today at the manual because I wanted to reflect on like, okay, well, what could you have known about the politics here? And all the sources are there. They list, the books that influence the game. And they suggest some books for children. If the children are interested in further reading that are not dry, or more, because Christopher Alexander's A Pattern Language is quite dry. No child should read it. But David Macaulay's books are, he wrote one about the city, and he's written one about castles. They're illustrated, and they have lots of detail about it's like cutaways, and explain all the systems and functioning of these elements of culture, normally habitations and other ways of being, and those are referenced there. I mean, it's just interesting to look at their list. So that was kind of cool too. It's like, we played D&D, and I remember in the first first D&D manuals I owned, it was like, oh, here's a reading list. Like, sure, I've read this one and this one, but like, here's another 24 that I haven't read, and
I think that list is
until I was older.
I think that list is still in there, even in 5th edition.
Is it? Yeah, I haven't gone looking for it because at this point it's not something I spend as much time with. And I'm a little more suspicious that WotC would be pushing their own products than I was of like 1st edition.
the Drizzt trilogy.
Please read 32 books about this dark elf.
New one out now. No, my memory is it's actually Gygax's and what's his name's list still.
Arneson, Dave Arneson.
Yeah, it's still their list, I think.
Oh, it's still that list? Okay.
I think so, yeah. But anyway, somebody will correct me. I looked at it, last couple of years because we were playing.
So but... you have no idea.
So, vague memory. It's probably a completely different list. There's probably no list, in fact. I just made it up. So while you were talking, I looked up City Skylines game disease because I wanted you made the point about social health over the past couple of years, and I was like, public health. I wonder if there is if you can build a CDC equivalent in City Skylines. So they explicitly have no official diseases in the game, but you can cause sickness in the city through obviously poop streets, I suppose, and other infectious, pseudo, I guess diseases. They call them sicknesses. But I was just kind of curious about, and then I read on and I see, okay, there's some mods that people have added for infectious diseases, which is like, ugh, okay, wow,
yeah.
But anyway, I was just kind of interested to Artemis's, question. Like, okay, these developers just recently made a modern version of this. What lines did they have? And infectious diseases was clearly a line where they're like, we can't simulate that in this game for good reason. But I just was kind of curious as you were mentioning public health, because like, I bet you in SimCity 2000, there's no, there's a hospital, but there's no like CDC equivalent.
No. There's just kind of generally, sort of things that might be beneficial to your populace that the medical person will advocate for, that are Sydney ordinances, basically. So like CPR campaign or no smoking initiatives and things like that.
I saw that.
Which is, there are limitations like that, which, actually probably worth talking about, your anti-progress playthrough as well, because we were reflecting before recording about so the sorts of city ordinances that are actually around. I've been in a city that had one that was unusual, at least when I heard about it. But maybe you should start by describing Gotham Hamlets, Gothamlet. I don't know how you would describe this thing.
Gotham Villages, as you said, yeah. That's actually, I kind of want to read that Batman story now, where it's like Batman in a village, a medieval village or something.
He's like in some little Morrowind town.
Or no, maybe it's more of like a backwater, like a Justified kind of thing, where it's
I see
the backwater semi-modern. Anyway, yeah. So last episode we talked about how the game inherently pushes you toward progress, and I guess we shouldn't be surprised. It's called SimCity, and cities are cities, and they are supposed to grow and flourish. So I actually had started this last session. I didn't bring it up last episode, and then had another PC refresh and had to start all over again. So I kind of started to simulate that again, but didn't have time to go as far as I wanted to. But anyway, I was trying to fight the progress machine to see if what I could muster. I don't think I'm smart enough to figure out how to achieve that. There's probably a way to do it, but I basically kind of made, as Brett said, little hamlets that were loosely connected, but separated as far as I was concerned, separated. But I guess the game probably just considers it all one city, even though they're geographically not next to each other.
Right.
Right. But as you might imagine, it's just a complete failure because I was trying to fight progress and keep them small, and the game was telling me to essentially expand, and so I could only really go so far. And then of course your budget you're in the red for too long, and then there's just nothing you can do because you can't really, I guess maybe, I don't know. I'm guessing because I really don't know what the math was doing, but I got the impression that like people didn't want to move to my city because they're like, sure, what is this city? Like I have to travel between these small groups of dwellings or something, like I think it kind of confused the system. And so, I'm sure there's a way for somebody smarter than myself to do that. But we know, we talked about it on one of the episodes. We know that the min-max version of this game is, it's like there's an equation, right? Like there's some ratio of industrial, residential, and commercial, and you put those in blocks of 8, and and you repeat that, and you put a street around them, and every 5 ones you put a water pump, and there's like a formula. And I was trying to find that equivalency for villages that were separated and could not. But the game definitely fought me on it for sure.
Yeah. No, I mean, you need a huge influx. You need a lot of people to come in who have a lot of money to spend, if you're going to build the villages in Florida. It doesnn't just happen, right? It does. I don't think, I think that's the game.
I need a better PR campaign.
Yeah. Yeah. You needed somebody, you needed a rich political, faction to I'm not saying who,
okay, yeah,
but you needed an influx of wealth to sustain such a thing, and that's unlikely.
You meant Disney.
I did not mean Disney, actually. No, their place is called Constitution or something. I'm talking about the villages.
No, it's not place. Constitution. It's Celebration.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I could not.
The most terrifying
that's
town.
That's a different thing.
Yeah,
that's Five Nights at Freddy's right there. Anyway, no, I was not. I was not trying to say one thing.
Kidding.
No, I think that it. I mean, and I don't. I don't necessarily think that's wrong. In some sense, right? I mean, I think that is part of the story of America, right? That small towns kind of get squashed, and I think that's something.
What a segue!
We live with, right? Yeah.
Well, not a small town, but
you
got to tell your story now.
Oh, you want me to go into my my bigger city getting squashed? Yeah, so I actually went. Yeah, so I didn't want to see any cities get squashed under Godzilla's boot or anything like that. So I was looking through the scenarios which ship with the game, and there are a bunch of basically little tests of like, can you recover from XYZ? But almost all X, Y, and Z are natural disaster or fantastic disaster. So like, your giant robots and your Godzillas. So there were floods and hurricanes and tornadoes. There was like your, what's it called? Microwave transmission, antenna was misaligned, there was a nuclear disaster, like your nuclear plant blew. So there are all kinds of things that were, on this like wide spectrum of real to unreal. There was one that was called Dullsville that I referred to in the intro, which was like, yeah, there's people, moved here. It's a nice place and there's nothing to do. It's boring and people are bored. So you gotta find a way. I mean, so it's like there's some weird scenarios in there. And then there's Flint, Michigan, in 1973, and that's a little early because I actually went and looked it up. Flint first had its big withdrawal by GM in 1978, so it's not exactly the same. And there are other pressures that would have been happening in the mid 70s, like the oil crisis, which would have been around the same time, 77, 8, 9, something like that. I can remember it, which is amazing since I was -4 at the time. But yeah, anyway, so there's a number of things going on there. And they set a quote unquote disaster scenario in Flint, Michigan. So I was like, well, that one stands out. And I was like, well, let me try it. I felt weird doing it. As a person who also feels weird playing like modern set Call of Duty games, even feels a little weird with World War II ones. I nonetheless gave it a go. And the thing I will say is I just wish that the people who ran Flint in the 1970s were as smart as I am. Because clearly there was a way to get out of all their problems. It was just easy, and that really showed me the limits of the simulation to simulate real systemic problems. Because, the goal was arbitrary, first of all. Like, I don't know that this goal would have helped real world Flint. It was grow your industrial base to 21,000, I guess, jobs. I don't know, 21,000 units from 10,000 units within 5 years. And of course that was not that hard. I went and talked to all my advisors at the beginning. I blew away a lot of roads because my transportation guy was like, we have way too many roads. I just went and looked at the map and was like, okay, anywhere there are no cars, I'll just get rid of those. And made sure that every place was still reachable, but, might take a little driving around. I rezoned a whole bunch of places where people had moved out to be industrial. And then I dropped taxes to 0. And all of that happened over time. Like, I didn't immediately drop taxes to 0. I sort of like whittled it down as I was getting close to the deadline. Okay, well, we'll go further. We'll go denser. We'll make sure we'll put in a new power plant here. It also left me with a lot of money, which I was like, I'm not sure that was true for Flint. I don't know. But there was I had a lot more resources and of course a lot more sort of instant, even though the simulation lags a little bit, I still had a lot of sort of instant remedies that I could apply that would have taken time, and it also made me reflect that one of the things that the game assumes is, well, if you just lower the taxes, then the businesses will come, and that everything will be fine. But we've seen that's not true. There have been a lot of incentives to attract businesses all across the country. I watched a documentary in 2019 called American Factory, which was about a Chinese corporation opening a factory in a depressed, I want to say, Ohio town. I don't remember where. It was a glass factory. And it did not go as everyone hoped, despite a huge amount of money invested, and I know that story continued after filming was done, these things don't always work out. And there is a sort of idealized, well, if you just had all the knobs of power, you could make Flint rebound. And it's like, well, yeah, but there's a lot of stuff you're not simulating here. Are there the businesses? Are they prepared to move, in the 1970s when we were entering a recession, partly, driven by the oil crisis? There's a lot going on that you naively playing the game. You might think, oh, I don't know why, like I said facetiously at the beginning, why they didn't just do these things. It would have saved everything.
Yeah.
The world is way more complicated. And so I was really surprised that they chose to represent a real world location like that directly. I mean, they literally map it out. Like, it takes up the whole map. There's all these like signs posted in places that point you at interesting locations that I assume exist in the real Flint. I don't have any context. I've never been there. But it was wild. It was wild being like, yeah, I could just avoid that whole problem that Flint had, just by being smart with tax policy and some rezoning, and a little bit of, like, I'm also just blowing away people's houses. Like,
yeah.
And it costs, whatever, $2 or whatever the bulldozer is. And it's like, okay, well, eminent domain doesn't really work quite that way. You're probably not going to get it. Like, I don't know what the scale is. Maybe it's a factor of 1,000, say. But, you're not going to evict somebody for $2,000 from their little plot, the home you just wrecked. I don't know. There's a lot of simplification here to make the simulation behave in the fun way. And that set aside the real world economic disaster that was Flint in the 70s and into the 80s, and that continues today with other problems, compounded problems, was just like, I don't know, did not rub me the right way, let's say.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking, do you think there was sort of like be a hero kind of mentality here, of like, because we were talking about Michael Moore's movie Roger and Me, which I would say is probably the one that made him, got that's
what put him on the map.
That put him on the map, right? And so people knew more. People outside of Michigan knew a lot more about Flint than before that. And I don't, I could see that maybe being an influence to this scenario being added, because that was 89. The movie came out. We looked up ahead of time. Brett remembered from sheer memory, which I still don't believe. And then this game, this game was 93, right? And then the original was 89. Right. So, correct. The scenarios, I don't think the scenarios shipped with, maybe they did ship. Maybe I thought maybe it was an added thing, but it's just like, everyone kind of the zeitgeist, maybe not the right word for this, but the collective consciousness of Flint's situation, and then like, be the hero and, go in and, I mean, not, a tone deaf, of course, but just trying to figure out the
choice there. It's funny because it does stand out so starkly again. I mean, there's other real world locations, in these other things, and there were some natural disasters that may have reflected actual events at the time that I just don't recall. Because there was one that was like South Carolina and flooding, and I was like, well, maybe that happened. Like, I don't remember that, and I don't remember what the date was or anything like that, and whether that would have been reflective. But the thing that I think galled me most was like, well, be the hero is like, well, just do something that wouldn't work. Like,
right.
It works for our simulation, but it's so pat,
it's contrived, yeah.
And it's also very, it sort of puts the politics right there on the sleeve of like, well, just if there were no taxes, then everything would be fine. You just have a small sales tax, and everything would just work, its way out. Like, flat tax people, promote or whatever. Like, everything should just be simpler. It's like, well, the world's not simple, and even though this is a very robust and complicated sim, it's still not robust and complicated enough.
There's limits,
where you could be a hero in Flint, in the 70s. I'm not saying there wasn't any mismanagement. I certainly don't remember that time well enough. And I could see, lagging of city officials and things like that. I can imagine there would have also been just like disbelief and like, but I also think that there are real difficulties to attracting, new business that can make use of your trained workforce and like, et cetera. And it might look rosy, like we'll get Chrysler in here or whatever, and it'll be somebody else. And that's just not happening, and not just a story of Flint. It's a story of, I don't know, Western PA, for example, with the steel industry and et cetera. Like, I mean, there's any number of places in America where things like this have happened, and it felt uncomfortably glib to be like, you could have been the hero.
Yeah, exactly. That's, I mean, I wasn't bringing it up as a justification. I was just more kind of like thinking about what the motivation would have been. Similarly, up here in the Pacific Northwest, there are a lot of ex-logging towns, as you might imagine.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
That are just, they're just devastated. They've never recovered from that. I looked up while you're talking to the numbers, because you mentioned the scenario was 20,000 workers, I think you said, or from
something like, I don't know, it's 20,000 something. It's like on this graph.
So in the 70s, GM, the population of Flint was 190,000, and GM employed 80,000 people. So yeah,
they pulled out and they left behind 7,500 jobs at the time, and then that dropped further. As time went on. Yeah, I mean, just devastating. And that was true anywhere, in the U.S. where there was a lot of big industry. I mean, we've heard about that stuff in the last decade in terms of the prior election, where it was jobs in Ohio, that had moved, maybe because of NAFTA, certainly because of globalization and not really sort of thinking that through, and et cetera. But a lot of manufacturing left, like the air conditioning and, plant and that sort of thing, or things that I remember specifically. But I mean, just a whole, it's just not so simple.
Yeah.
and
if it were more accurate,
there's a fantasy fulfillment of like, I could have done it. So I do get it.
Well, there's
there's
a weird, like we talk about, for better for ill, I think it's just true. There's a power fantasy to a lot of video games, and I just never thought about SimCity being a power fantasy, but it kind of is to some degree, right? Of like just that, like I am omnipotent and can save Flint or make a mega city, like, I don't know.
Yeah. Or, I mean, there's even just none of the like horse trading that has to really go on, in politics of like, well,
the compromise.
You want this. Well, I want this, and maybe we can somewhere in that compromise find some good. Nobody's going to be happy. I mean, we're in the moment living through the punditry, just like on both, on every possible side of the student debt crisis, talking about, political choice. And it's like, this is way too complicated, and of course we just had any number of other major legislation at the federal level in the U.S. that you could talk about in the same way. It's like a compromise where nobody's really happy, but maybe some good things got done, and we got to be happy with that. And it's not the, like, I got all the way there. Now, I mean, it could be that if I had played that scenario out further, I would have found that what I had done had like irreversibly changed the tenor of the place, and I don't know what else would have happened as a result, but maybe that would have been the case, and maybe there would have been a dark side to my choices. But because there's like an endpoint of that scenario where they're like, ta-da, you did it, like you saved Flint, here's the key to the city, with a nice big big key that they give you. It was a very strange experience. And if it even had been hard, I might have felt differently about it, but it wasn't particularly hard for me. And I'm no awesome SimCity player. So anyway, it was a strange thing. Okay. Well, what do you say we start turning to takeaways? Yeah,
sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, we're at the end of a scenario, at the end of a series rather, and I want to.
We're at the end of a scenario.
We're also at the end of a scenario, and as we always do, of course, we take some takeaways. I think we're going to have a lot of overlap here, so I picked two that I thought you might not have, because I suspect I will echo at least two of yours. But why don't you go ahead and give me your first takeaway?
Yeah, these now that I'm looking at them, they're not in the best order, but the first one, which related to my last test scenario or session, was the focus on progress, I guess.
Yeah.
Which I guess as a takeaway, not like a major revelation if you're making a sim city or a city simulator. I guess
Right.
that's kind of the point. So it's maybe unfair, but I guess I'm actually not. The takeaway isn't with commentary. It's more of just a stating that is the goal. And I just had never thought about it that way. So the fact that, the systems are tuned toward it, the game encourages it, discourages the opposite, seemingly to me at least. Again, there might be a way to do it and still succeed. And that that it's just so focused on that concept. And like we kind of joked about SimTown or whatever, I guess there's some other simulator I might be looking for, but not a city simulator.
Yeah, it's funny because in the manual they actually do talk about if you want to try to stay small, like
They do.
Not that they give you any instructions as to how to do that, but it's more like, well, from the greatest megalopolis to the tiniest town, like you can do it all, in SimCity or whatever is kind of like the pitch in the intro or whatever. And it's I think that's I'll say the positive side of that might be that it is reflective of conditions on the ground in some ways, that we talked about over the series, right? That it is, it's accurate to the capitalistic society. And, having come from an area of the country where I see towns that are, have died or are dying, and the different ways they have to try to revitalize themselves can be very expensive and be a matter of luck in some cases, or luck in the sense of like, oh, we happen to be near these natural resources, beautiful natural resources, or we can orient around tourism, because people want to come and, I don't know, see the leaves fall or whatever in the fall. So it's, I do think that is possibly reflective. I had that on my list as well. So I will, just put a little check next to that one. Check. I'll take another one here because I'm not going to probably do a full 3 because, like I said, I think we have some overlap. But one of mine was to expose, explore, and explain your passions. This was for Will Wright after Bungling Bay. Something that he had discovered was more interesting to him than than the sort of flyover and raid Bungling Bay part of that game, was that he was super interested in the simulation of the supply chains and the economics behind the bunglings, I guess. And he kind of took it and then just, as we referred to, it would continue doing so, and going towards the Sims. I mean, there was a lot of other stuff that happened around in this era, but ultimately he got more towards the people. You in referenced Will TV or whatever, as a thing that talks about some of those things. But the corollary, of course, is also to find sort of broader passions or look in unusual places for games, because, in 1989, urban planning was not the hot new thing on the gaming frontier. At the time, it was probably, I don't know, more sprites than you could shake a stick at. Also, not too far. Well, I guess around 93, where we had Doom as well. So
I mean, rendering,
there were other
3D rendering.
Stuff. Yeah,
it's like this is
sure.
Like
starting to come. Yeah,
the opposite.
Yeah. Anyway, so that was one of mine. Anyway,
yeah, that's a good one. The 3 X's instead of the 4 X's.
Expose, explore, explain.
Incidentally, as you mentioned, sort of his mentality moving forward, I don't know if you saw, but his new company just got some additional investments for NFTs.
Stuff.
Yeah.
No. Yep. Tell me it's not so.
Nope, it's so.
No.
I just read that last week, I think. Yeah. Which they've been that company's been very quiet since he founded it. They really haven't said much, but that was a weird one to hear. And so my second one, I will combine two that I'm looking at them are basically related, and that is the thread that we had about commentary, whether intentional or not, commentary and perspective, and its role on the design of a simulation, which was surprising to me, and definitely a takeaway of like, I mean, it shouldn't have been a surprise, but when you get into it, and we talked a little bit about this with civilization specifically, because there's sort of, there's also what kind of civilization are they simulating, et cetera, and where do they emphasize, what systems do they emphasize, and they've expanded that over time in that series. I don't know where the city building simulations have gone these days, but the impact in so many ways. We talked about even the newspapers. We talked about how what the advisors value and what they yell at you about and what they don't, and then of course, even just how the simulation, which I'll combo with my indirect takeaway. So kind of a twofer here. Because of its indirect nature as a simulation, the math is inherently has a perspective on what is considered progress, to go with my first one. We talked about the church example. We talked about apartment buildings, condominiums, et cetera, and the progression there. And then just, obviously that a mega city being the end game major
Right.
success.
Right.
And that there's
Right.
inherent, whether intentional or not, there's an inherent statement being made there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that would be another one that I definitely would have on my list. So I'm not going to burden it further. We certainly talked a lot about that, the sort of inherent choices there. And I think from the very first episode, you brought that up. And it's of course something that I think I was happy looking back in the manual to see that they sort of showed their research, or at least showed the things that they used to sort of inform the sim. But that, I do think is really important to it, and the choices that you make there. I think it's also, we should take it a little bit. We should think about our responsibility there. Like, I don't think we're in the same place now that we were in 1989 or 93. And as an industry, we're way bigger and have way more of an impact than any title would have then. So there's definitely that sort of responsibility of knowing what you're saying and being aware of what you're saying, or at least thinking through more about what you're saying. Of course, we're still going to look back on things that are coming out today, 20 years from now when we're on episode 1200. And we'll talk about, what were they thinking here in the cold light of 2045? What were they thinking? Anyway, I have one here as really just my second one, because like I said, we have a lot of overlap. For me, I do want to applaud the sheer scope of this thing. Like, it's everything you could want from a sim from 1993. There's a million buildings. There's a lot of different, there's a tech tree, where you get anywhere from 3 to 9 or so different power plants just as one thing. There's a bunch of different, balloon buildings you can grow. And I don't know if there's more that happen over time, but like a sports stadium or the zoo or whatever, you can, build all of those things. You can, of course, watch just the evolution of your spaces, whether they're light or heavily zoned for, any of the three things. You have different buildings, and like in the subways and the railroads. And like, there is so much stuff, and they're putting cars, on all the roads and, et cetera. Like, there's a lot of art, there's, you look at this and you're like, of course this is like, I don't know, probably 16 and 256 color palettes, depending on the building. The hero buildings are probably, the ones that take up like 3x3 squares are probably allowed a bigger palette, but most are probably a small number. And just like technically speaking, there's a lot going on here. And then on top of that, like, there's go design your whole level. Tweak the generation algorithm if you want to more rivers or less rivers, or more elevation changes or less elevation changes or whatever. Like a million different ways that you can sort of even customize this thing, and then go in and work on it by hand. Furthermore, before you even start your level, I mean, there's just a lot. There's a lot of stuff. I think some of that was like exposing the tools that they were using to build the game. Be like, you know what, we could just put that in the box too. But there's a lot. There's a lot here, I mean, that's just a remarkable achievement. For probably a relatively small team. I don't have a count on the number of developers, but it's not a huge number back in 1993. And they really delivered a lot with a little. And I do think that is, they put so much stuff into the sim that it makes me wonder, like, what was it like? To some degree, you have to abstract so many things away because you can't, like, at a certain point, you have to cut things away because it's just not possible. Obviously, right? It's not possible. We have a real world. You can't simulate it. That's kind of where we're lamenting in some ways. It's like, well, why didn't you include this or that? At a certain point, you have to draw a line and say, okay, in this circle, we're going to do as much as we can. And everything else we're going to abstract, and it's just going to be a number coming in. And, I think they did an awful lot, and that circle is fairly large. And I think that is interesting, and well done.
Yeah, it's astounding. Right? And I remember that back then too, playing it when it came out, just like being just blown away, right? Seemingly impossible. Like, how is this,
Yeah.
How is this possible? One small, it's not small as far as workload goes, but one small feature that we didn't actually even talk about that I put in my notes and forgot to mention that relates to this is there are 3 zoom levels in the game.
Right, yeah.
And this is not a 3D game.
Right.
So every zoom level is a different set of art assets. Because you're basically swapping. It's not like they're just zooming in on the screen.
And you're rotating them for directions as well.
Yeah. So it's there's a lot of art assets there for one building. You have all those angles, and then you have 3 zoom levels. So that's.
I think some of that they probably did do sort of in an automated way in terms of generating them, but that always means somebody has to go later and touch it up.
There's still tech art
as well.
Yeah.
Yep. There's tech art to go and actually make sure that those still capture the shape of the thing, because you can lose important detail, and you actually have to make another pass over those things. That's an important point for sure at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. The last one I have is also a bit of a combo, but it relates to what you were just saying as far as this choosing what you're going to put into the circle, really. And I wrote it down as sort of like a simulation can't and maybe shouldn't be everything. And it kind of goes with the toy versus game debate that we know Maxis specifically would describe. And, or even toy versus, I guess, sim as well, that, this is an entertainment product. You're not trying to make something that a city could actually use to run its city. This is
Maxis did build a sort of entity to do that, or maybe they did it in-house. I can't remember, but they actually tried to do that.
They attempted to, I do.
They attempted to,
right, I do
to go to real business. Yeah.
To try to help. Yeah. Whatever, the cities or the military, who knows what, but education, actual simulation.
It didn't last long. A couple of years, I think.
I mean, it makes logical sense that they would attempt it, right? Serious games were not a complete genre yet.
The other thing too, though, is like that the marketing was like pushing on how realistic it is, right? And I'm sure naively, and especially with what computer science researchers were telling, funders since the 70s of like we're on the cusp of AI, and we've been on the cusp of AI now for like 40 years. So, or more actually. It goes into the early 70s when they were doing things like I don't need to go into details, but like, stuff that I like studied in class of like, oh yeah, they did this thing, and that was pretty hard, and like, and then it really hasn't gone much further because it's really, really hard. So I think that there was an expectation from policymakers or whatever that like, oh, computers can do so much now, and like, look at how real this thing is, that it made sense to like try to turn that into a business. Sorry, but go on.
No, that was it. I mean, it was just the
tangent.
No, I don't think it was. I think it was related to just there's a dividing line there of product versus true simulation, and going with the sort of commentary and perspective in design, kind of counterpoint. Like to some degree, you are still making a simulation product that is meant to be entertainment, And you might get some education out of it, but Maxis was not ever marketed as an edutainment fully, right? They were making these toys, so to speak, and so those are just, I guess, the takeaway is really that sort of reality, right? Of like, there are limitations, and those are there for a good reason, and we don't want to play an actual true simulation of a city because it wouldn't be entertaining. So it's that double-edged sword of okay, there's commentary and perspective, but you really also can't and don't want to do everything. So there's always going to be a tension between those two things.
Yeah. And honestly, if you want to have that experience, run for city council.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and do the hard work.
You will see the hard, real work, which I appreciate more and more, for sure. So, so that's our, unless you have any others.
No, that was it. That was it.
Okay. Yeah. I did not have that one, though I did have your other two, and I thought that I might. So I tried to find the ones that were a little more out there for me.
Yeah. Good.
To contribute.
So
all right. Are you ready to move to some feedback?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say no promises. I do feel like this year we've had bad luck with speakers.
We have.
Unfortunately. So I apologize for that. We definitely are trying. I still am flabbergasted we never got anybody from Morrowind, but never say never. I'm still trying, to be honest.
You keep trying.
But we're seeing what we can do for this one too, but obviously we won't have it. We won't have anybody, no matter who it is, ready for next episode. So we'll probably be moving on to, who knows what. But yeah, let's. I just wanted to let people know that we're attempting, but no promises.
Yep, and we'll even see if there is an episode next week. I
don't know where fair enough. Yeah, the holiday coming up.
We have the holiday, so we normally record and are recording now on Monday. Okay, let's go to a review and a couple of emails. No singing, sadly, but thanks for sending this in.
Thank God.
This is from Midnight 22. That's midnight with a K in the middle. It's silent.
Yes.
Yep. That's. Yep, playing to you right there. The subject is awesome discussion with a great perspective. Brett and Tim's fascinating discussion is the highlight of my morning commute. Currently on Shadow of the Colossus, which inspired me to play Eco for the first time, followed by Shadow. Their perspective on games is teaching me to be more thoughtful when playing games and to look into the why of systems and how it all comes together to make a cohesive product. That is from Midnight 22, and thank you, Midnight 22. Brief, nothing really to discuss there, but I'm glad that he is enjoying some games that we love, obviously, and playing those in particular. But yeah, thanks for the review. Love to have them. Do you want to hit the first email I sent to you?
Yes, let's do it. What makes a successful city? From Chris. Brett. This is specifically to Brett.
Yep.
You made an offhand comment in the second SimCity 2000 episode, roughly to the effect that what's really important in a city is the happiness of the people who live there. Perhaps you've seen it already, but there was a fascinating bit of work earlier this year that argues exactly this point. Long story short, it appears that services and natural resources that make people happy are more important for jobs and growth than the quote-unquote business friendliness of a city. So probably cities should direct their resources towards services and amenities and away from business incentives per se. And then there's a link Keep up the great work on the pod. SimCity 2000 was one of my first favorite games, and despite that nostalgia, I'm really enjoying the opportunity to revisit it with an eye toward the many cultural and political assumptions that are baked into it. You haven't mentioned it yet, but some of the deluxe versions include a companion program called the Urban Renewal Kit. I forgot about that. Yeah. It had an amazing set of features, but the use of that term, urban renewal, is yet one more example of the cultural, racial, and socioeconomical perspective that the designers had. Yeah. Chris.
Yep. I had not read articles to that effect. I do not actually spend a lot of time on urban planning or dynamics in my spare time. I'm mostly a fiction guy. But I did read it after he had sent it in, and I appreciated like looking at it's a very I did not read it end to end. It was more like, let me pick up the highlights here because there's a lot of like data analysis and stuff. Thinking about like comparable cities and like how they approached their particular issues. I will say that I sort of came to that reflection on my own just from sort of being aware of New England, and where I grew up. So it was more of a reflection of sort of what I had noticed more than anything else growing up, or, speaking to my parents or something like that about places around there and places that I visited up there, that kind of drove me to that conclusion as well. But I do think that that's I guess that was just sort of a philosophical point. Like, I think that should be the goal, is like, we should be here for people, and that anything else to improving people's lives is really just the means to that. And it shouldn't be the other way around, where the people are the means to the business ends. I know that puts me probably squarely on one side of a particular political divide, but that's where I am, and I'm going to own it. So,
yeah, especially when they obfuscate the people in the sim, right? It's down to numbers. It's not really about anything else. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I have one here from Mystery Dip. We almost never hear from Mystery Dip, so it's good. The subject is SimCity 2000 Endgame. In SimCity 2000, you have an alternative option to the density question, arcologies. These are mini self-contained cities available after the year 2000, with more advanced options appearing every 50 years through 2150. While two of them look Judge Dredd-ish, the other two resemble idealistic future utopian styling. The last arcology available is called the Launch Arcology. It resembles something that could go into space, and there were pre-internet rumors, or maybe a hint in the instructions, that it was possible. While I never did achieve it, that was my personal end goal. Now, years later, I can confirm both that it was possible and that I would never have had the patience to reach it. Here's what a wiki says about it. Quote, the launch arco trick can be done in the DOS and Mac v11 and also Windows version of SimCity 2000. After building 301 launch arcos at a cost of $200,000 each, and after the year 2051, a message will appear saying, the Exodus has begun. The arcos will appear to explode one by one, taking over 2 minutes to complete, and the game will now show another message. Your launch arcos have departed into space to find new worlds. You have been compensated for the construction. And that is from Mystery Dip. So there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, as with any good city simulator, the point is to leave the planet.
Yeah, that's right. You want to get away from your neighbors. Yeah. Well, fundamentally, in the end, which is not really true of an arcology.
Because everyone goes together.
The whole building is your neighbor. Arcologies are a whole like cyberpunk thing, right? That was a whole thing in cyberpunk, and I guess this was a whole thing back in the 80s and 90s. Like, well, as time goes on, we're going to build these buildings where everything that you need is contained in the one building and never leave it, which is not actually even new to that time. High Rise, which was a, what's his name? There was a film adaptation a couple years ago. I'm not remembering the guy's name, the writer. It'll probably come to me 10 minutes after we finish recording. Anyway, High Rise, I think, was written in the 70s and basically posits something like an arcology and how badly it all goes. If you've seen the film adaptation or read the book, it's a whole thing. He also wrote Crash, from which another film adaptation was made a couple decades ago now, nearly. Sort of a strange dude in terms of his approach to storytelling. But are you looking him up? Because I can't remember his name.
Ballard? Is that?
Yes, J.G. Ballard.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, couldn't come up with it. For sure. He wrote some strange books. I suspect that if everything was contained in one building, people would kind of slowly go mad. Can confirm.
I've seen Dredd.
I don't. Into a pandemic.
I know, yeah, we don't.
Yeah.
The Judge Dredd movie.
Yeah, I know you're not onto what I'm talking about. I think we should probably put a pin in it there because I know we're trying to get you off in a reasonable amount of time. But I want to thank folks for sending those into devgameclub@gmail.com. We do have a handful more touching not only on this, but I think we still have one Mega Man one left.
I have a Mega Man one, yeah.
Yeah, okay. We'll get to it. We'll get to it soon.
Okay.
The next episode, I think, will be fine. But thank you for the review and for the email. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com or on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
You are twitching. I don't know if you're returning to that tonight or not.
I am.
At twitch.tv. Oh, I look forward to it.
I did tweet about that, though obviously you will hear this after the fact.
But you could go watch the VOD and see how many times it takes him to kill Smog and Ornstein. He's still playing Dark Souls, and I gather you have gathered some resources. You've prepped, and you think you're gonna. This is the time.
I prepped. I did the Black Orb. And I leveled up and got some humanity, and
and made your weapon went in a different direction with your weapon.
I switched my weapon up, so it should be doing more damage. So I am as prepared as I think I will be able to be, and we're going to go after those two suckers shortly. But in the past, from when you were hearing this.
Yeah, but you can. Anybody who's wants to go catch up with it, you can find it there. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by friend of the cast Aaron Evers, and our logo and our merch store is by Mark Garcia, where you can find a shirt or hoodie immortalized with the blink from a Dark Souls stream not too long ago. Have fun bringing the industrial base back to Flint, Michigan this week. And good night.
Good night.